It's a great honor to be with friends. I see Lant Pritchett here. I see Ricardo here. I'm going to talk about sovereign failure. The bad news is that there are no slides, there are no overheads. It gets even worse. I'm going to read something so I don't screw it up. And when I was thinking about the connection between what I'm talking about and what we were talking about this morning, I thought about Ricardo's wonderful and very insightful metaphor about monkeys and trees and forests. And that metaphor is working through this wonderful piece of data. It's important that the monkeys have lots of trees, that the trees are close by, and that the trees grow and create a forest. And that metaphor is, I think, been interesting. I'm here to ask what happens when the forest burns down. I'm here to ask, how do we protect the forest and keep it from being destroyed? And that brings us to the issue of sovereignty and the role of states. What I'm going to present to you is really a research agenda rather than a set of conclusions. I'm not an economist. Some of it may seem way too schematic, but I'm trying to do something relatively simple to get down to the sovereign functions that all governments must do. We had a discussion this morning about industrial policy in which these were things that governments could do, they might do, and it's important if they do them to do them well, and that's why this atlas is so tremendously important, to focus government policy on what it might do in these areas. I want to focus on the grimmer subjects of the things that government must do. The bad news is that I will read a bit of text. The good news is it won't go on too long. An economic crisis is an ordeal, but it's also an incredible political opportunity, as we know from the experience of Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't let a crisis go to waste. He seized the opportunity politically to essentially reinvent the relationship between the market and the state in the modern economy. And it seems obvious to me, at least, and perhaps to you, that an equally fundamental reinvention of the relationship between the market and state will issue from the crisis that we're living in. Yet nearly 4 years into this, we're still waiting our Roosevelt moment. That is the moment when leadership plus economic insight comes together into a vision of what the state must do to sustain growth and economic prosperity in the 21st century. And I want to put a lot of emphasis on the word must here. In good times, we will disagree, and vigorously, about what governments could do or might do, but in hard times, it's real important to agree on what government absolutely must do. And getting beyond ideological deadlock about what we might do and the proper role of government in normal times, it's difficult, but crises concentrate the mind and provide a moment both for intellectual and political leadership. Roosevelt forged the New Deal, obviously, by forcing debate back to fundamentals, by insisting that there were some responsibilities of government that only government could discharge. And he got public debate to focus again not on what government might or could do, but what government absolutely had to do. And I wanted to find those musts, those must-dos, as sovereign responsibilities. And because my background is in working on failed states, I wanted to focus on the positive question of what are sovereign responsibilities by focusing on the negative. What does sovereign failure look like? Sovereign failure means at least three things. It means losing control of your territory to a foreign invader, a domestic insurgency, or a terrorist threat. It could mean failing to protect a population from a natural or environmental disaster. But it also, and obviously and centrally, means losing control of your economy to systemic bank failure, a radical currency devaluation, or hyperinflation. So sovereign failure, roughly defined, simply means exposing a sovereign who exposes a population to large-scale threats to their way of life, and if that's sovereign failure, then sovereign responsibility would focus the capacities of government on preventing these systematic threats. And the capacities available to do that are the unique properties of sovereigns. Their capacity to coerce and to secure consent, and moreover, these are unique capacities because sovereigns by definition have a monopoly over coercion and consent. You'll notice I'm talking about the responsibilities of sovereigns, not governments. Governments come and go. Sovereigns endure. Policy fashions change, but sovereign responsibilities remain constant. Governments live to win elections, but they exist to serve sovereign interests. Governments can make guarantees, but a sovereign guarantee is of an altogether more serious and enduring kind. And I'm trying to get to this core of sovereign responsibility that all governments have. And you focus on this primary interest, which is to make sure that systemic threats do not threaten populations. If that's the fundamental interest, the fundamental interest of sovereign responsibility is to put solid ground under the feet of citizens. And this basic insurance function is the foundation of confidence in a population. Economic confidence depends on the assurance that sovereigns will do their jobs as lenders, borrowers, insurers, and punishers of last resort. And as we know, an economic crisis is a moment of last resort. It's a moment in which we discover, as we did in the Great Depression, that markets cannot recover on their own without the last resort actions of sovereigns. So crises reveal why sovereigns are essential to market recovery, but crises also obviously show up the limitations of sovereigns, and so I think we're in a unique moment in the world in which never have been sovereigns more necessary to recovery, but never has confidence in sovereigns been lower. Right now, cash-rich companies and investors will not inject capital into the economy because they lack confidence, not just in the strength and future prospects for effective demand, but they lack confidence in the credibility of sovereigns. One of the things that I've noticed is that I began my academic career thinking about failed states and failing states at the edges of the international system. Countries like Haiti, Congo, or Somalia. And that's where sovereign failure was once confined. At the risk of starting an argument and making you angry, and one of the things I notice is the way sovereign failure is coming into the center of the state system. And here are the examples you're not going to like. But in the past decade, we've experienced sovereign failure at the very heart of the global system. I would argue that 9/11 was a sovereign failure, a superpower failing and unable to protect its territory. I'd argue that Hurricane Katrina was a sovereign failure to protect a population from a recurrent, envisageable, and preventable natural disaster. I'd argue that the Gulf oil spill was a failure to prevent widespread environmental harm, again, that could have been regulated and could have prevented. And obviously the most serious sovereign failure of all turned on the failure to regulate in such a way as to prevent the financial crisis of 2008. The most ingenious way to excuse these failures, of course, is to call them black swans, events so unusual that those who failed to prevent them can't be blamed. But I think the black swans argument is too forgiving. All of these events were predicted. The dashboards were flashing red in all of these cases. Sovereign failure resulted not from a failure to predict, but from a failure to act in time. And so I get myself to a place that I've not thought about before, but which I want to propose to you, which is the essence of sovereign responsibility in a 21st century economy, is thinking the unthinkable and preparing for it. Unless we think this is such a particularly odd and demanding expectation of government and of sovereigns, I think we need to realize that governments and sovereigns do this all the time. That's their job. Preparing for invasions, incursions, or terrorist strikes is the essence of defense planning. Preparing for low probability but catastrophic threats like pandemics, chemical leaks, escape or theft of radioactive materials is the daily bread of emergency preparedness in all sovereign states. So thinking the unthinkable is what sovereigns do, and I would argue it is what sovereigns must do in the economic realm for reasons that relate to risk. And that's for reasons that are familiar, because citizens and firms can only prevent risks to themselves, not to the system as such. And many of the risk behaviors adopted by firms and citizens actually increase risk to the system as a whole. Economies tumble into systemic risks as a consequence of rational behaviors whose negative externalities individuals cannot anticipate as a systematic phenomenon, because if they could anticipate them, they wouldn't be taking the risk in the first place. And that's why risk pricing cannot be left to citizens and can't be left to markets alone. At the firm level, rational risk avoidance by individual firms, for example, by taking out credit default swaps, which we talked about this morning, can generate adverse consequences for the rest of the economy. The largest players in a system can spread toxic risk to an economic system as a whole without intending or desiring to do so. And that's why only sovereigns can be charged with the difficult but not impossible task of risk assessment and risk prevention for the entire economy. That's why sovereigns are the people who have to think the unthinkable on behalf of the rest of us. Looking back over the last decade, I think sovereigns have few excuses for their failures of guardianship. In the U.S., accumulating asset bubbles, slowing economic activity, unsustainable inflows of foreign capital were all indicators, flashing red, that clearly signaled trouble ahead at least a year before Lehman. So the question is not whether sovereigns have the capability to think the unthinkable. I think, and this wonderful atlas that we have this morning is yet another addition to the econometric dashboards available to sovereigns. And these dashboards get more sophisticated by the year, and thank God they do. But if the dashboards are getting more sophisticated, why aren't sovereigns reading them? The question then is why sovereigns have done such a poor job to think the unthinkable and prevent the unthinkable in real time. This time it will be different. Hope's eternally foolish bet against experience partly explains why sovereigns fail, and as Ken Rogoff has shown us all, sovereigns fail all the time. Throughout history, markets have mispriced risk in bubble conditions, and sovereigns, being human, have done exactly the same, overvaluing their own assets, undervaluing their liabilities, and underappreciating the buildup of risk to their populations. So, sovereigns of all kinds have defaulted on their debts, lost control of their currencies, and allowed inflation to devastate savings and standards of living. And the question is why sovereigns keep getting away with this, why they get away with failure so often. I mean, by definition, a sovereign ought to be better informed and better financed than any other beast in the forest. But despite these advantages, they fail often. And the reason seems to be that in economic affairs, they know they are too big to fail. While some sovereign failures, this is, I think, one of the things that I've learned from my other work, some sovereign failures, like allowing an invasion, a revolution, or a domestic insurgency, can put a sovereign out of business. Economic failure does not. And I think that helps to explain why sovereigns habitually overinvest in defense and territorial control, because failure in that dimension is fatal, while underinvesting in economic risk prevention, because they know they can survive failure, they'll be bailed out. Venezuela's a recurrent defaulter. Argentina, both have survived defaults, currency devaluations, hyperinflation. Ireland, Iceland, Greece, Portugal have all failed to protect their populations in very basic systemic ways, and they all remain in business, unlike the firms in their own countries who've gone under the waves. Now, it's true that these countries do pay a price for failure, higher interest rates when they go out and borrow the next time. They face punishing loan conditions from international institutions when they seek to rebuild, and they incur reputational damage when they seek to attract inward investment. So no sovereign escapes scot-free from failure, but none goes out of business. Only the politicians do. Governments fail, but sovereigns endure. I think we know why this pattern arises. It's because sovereigns survive because they're not ultimately market actors, but providers of vital public goods, order and territorial integrity. Their economic failures have to be forgiven because their public goods functions are irreplaceable. For this reason, other sovereigns bail them out. They do so to protect their own lending institutions, but also to protect the stability of the sovereign system itself. And so the structural interdependence of sovereigns within a global international system has a very obvious but very paradoxical result. This sovereign interdependence, aided by the IMF, the World Bank, the G20, and all our multilateral institutions, helps to ensure economic stability, but it also institutionalizes moral hazard. Sovereigns that fail know they must be bailed out to keep the system of sovereign authority going. Rogoff adds another element of this puzzle when he points out that sovereign failures are not, generally speaking, failures of solvency. The government usually has some revenue to service debt, but they estimate that the sacrifices they'd have to impose on their citizens to ensure full repayment are simply too high. So they refuse to pay or beg better terms of sovereigns or creditors in the expectation that they can't be refused. In Europe, failing sovereigns are forcing stronger ones to bail them out, and the stronger ones are doing so through gritted teeth to save their creditors, but also to save the stability of the sovereign system on which their own order function depends. So another aspect of this is that sovereign governments all know that they can lose the power to compel and the authority to secure consent if they push their own citizens too hard. The duel being fought out on the streets between the Greek demonstrators and the government will determine how far this particular sovereign can impose costs on a population without losing its capacity to rule altogether. So sovereign failure occurs in the economic domain because sovereigns judge that the debt repayment might jeopardize their order function and hence their actual survival as states. And all other states know this. This is also true of authoritarian systems. While they have greater capacity to impose sacrifice on their populations, even authoritarian sovereigns, and I'm thinking of China, understand the limits of coercion and the risks of losing legitimacy. Authoritarian and democratic sovereigns alike know there's a limit to what the public can bear when failure occurs. Other sovereigns know that too, because they also know that there is no one else inside a system, inside China, to impose the costs, no one else who can decide when the limit of public tolerance has been reached. So the negative externalities of sovereign failure are a price that strong sovereigns bear for the sake of the sovereign system itself. Sovereignty delivers us a global public good, some kind of order, but at the price of organized moral hazard, transferring responsibility from weak to strong states. Now, the weakness of these weak states are so well known that global governance structures have emerged to kind of help them with their responsibilities. But the point here is that global governance institutions will never acquire the crucial capacity to compel, except where a sovereign's actions threaten international peace and security. That is, when a sovereign threatens the territorial integrity of another state. And that's the only time that coercive, forceful intervention is likely in the international system. And global governance lacks legitimacy where it matters, on the ground, with citizens, among ordinary citizens who have to bear the consequence of adjustment policies. So multinational organizations can coordinate, they can refund sovereigns who've destroyed their balance sheets, they can lay out a desired regimen that will lead the patient back to health, but only sovereigns have the power to impose sacrifice, to force regulation on unwilling markets, and to impose penalties on market actors who expose the whole system to risk. There's simply no way out of this ultimate sovereign responsibility. Economic crisis has revealed these sovereign responsibilities clearly. They have to be the lender of last resort, the creditor of last resort, the investor of last resort, the punisher of last resort, and the protector of last resort. And that means that the sovereign has to remain the one actor too big to fail, lest economic failure lead to order failure. So the crisis, it seems to me, is a teachable moment. It's taught us something about the irreducible necessity of sovereign authority, not just in the international system, but in the international economic system. And it's given us, and here's where I take my life in my hands, a kind of bare bones list of what all sovereigns absolutely have to do in the economic sphere. Responsibility one is to step in and maintain effective demand when it's insufficient, with unemployment benefits, pensions, training and education allowance, and systematic investment in economically critical infrastructure. Second responsibility is balancing the maintenance of effective demand in the short term with deficit control in the long. Spending more than a country earns without clear targets to bring expenditure and receipts back to order is a sure recipe for sovereign failure. And the lesson from Europe, and we're living this right now, the lesson from Europe in relation to the debt crisis in Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain surely has to be, this is a phrase well known in the Kennedy School, every tub on its own bottom. Every sovereign has to take responsibility for its own balance sheet, and common currency regimes that allow sovereigns to pass the risk of default onto other sovereigns who can run up more debt than they can afford and pass it on to the stronger sovereigns in a system, that has to be changed so that sovereigns assumed basic, irreducible fiscal responsibility within their own sovereign territory. The federalization of this, I don't think, solves the problem. At the end of the day, the Greek sovereign has to be responsible for the Greek balance sheet, period. Responsibility three means keeping currency fluctuations and inflation under control so that markets have stable expectations to guide pricing, hiring, and investment. And there, the elephant in the room is capital controls. The possibility that countries like Brazil that have had to use capital controls to control hot money, a lot of bigger sovereigns may have to look seriously at that to prevent surges in asset valuations that could have systemically dangerous effects. Responsibility four means that while the sovereign itself has to be too big to fail, no one else in the economy can be too big to fail. This is the toughest one of them all. And to make it still tougher, in my judgment, it has to include, Ian Bremmer has made this point, the entities that can't become too big to fail in the economy include state-owned enterprises and national oil companies. You can easily see oversized, Leviathan-sized state enterprises, particularly nationalized oil companies, that could fail, especially in a commodity price collapse, leaving the sovereign itself mortally exposed. This would be especially true in weak states like Angola, but it's not a possibility to be excluded in strong ones. So the phenomenon of systematic risk has revived what was once understood, at least in Smithian classical economics, as a core function of the sovereign to preserve free competition. The positive rationale for government intervention, in case we've forgotten it, is to enhance competition, keep it fair, while the negative rationale, which has surged into salience now, is to prevent the emergence of competitors so large that their collapse would entail systemic risk for everyone. Anti-monopoly action returns to the core business of sovereigns simply to prevent systemic risk, and that may also include the prevention of foreign takeovers that would concentrate ownership and reduce competition and expose national systems of credit and finance to transnational risk. Responsibility 5 is difficult to describe, and I'm fumbling around like everybody else to describe it, but responsibility 5 relates essentially to microeconomic regulation of firms, and the moral goal, the ethical goal, but also the economic goal surely, is to force responsibility back on those who undertake risk, to resolder risk and responsibility. This has always been, if you think about it, a core element of the sovereign's order function. As the punisher of last resort, sovereigns are in the business. That's what we pay them to do, to force individuals to take responsibility for harms to third parties. Light touch regulation of markets is a science. Nobody wants heavy-handed government regulation here. The jurisprudence of prosecuting economic fraud is very complicated, but the essential task, the core task, seems to me clear enough, which is to resolder risk and responsibility. Modern financial products have the property of diffusing risk system-wide and dissevering the risk from the initial risk taker. And so some of the things that people say in the street seem to me to be true. Everybody has to have skin in the game. And if you haven't got skin in the game, you can't play. Because if you haven't got skin, you'll wreck the game. And that element of resoldering risk and responsibility is a sovereign function. Each country will do it differently. I'm no expert, but I'm convinced that the sovereign state must be there. And that then implies a different view of markets. Enforcing responsibility for risk requires transparency. Markets must operate as public institutions. Goods must be publicly traded with disclosure and transparency so that regulators can keep watch and so that the caveat emptor function can actually function. It can't, caveat emptor can't function in a system of, malign and organized ignorance. So no dark markets, no dark pools, no insider dealing. Just as sovereigns are there to insist that no product can be traded publicly if it poses a threat to health and safety, so no financial product should be traded if it entails systemic risk. Given the exponential growth of algorithmic computer-traded financial products, it's vital that all of them be traded publicly and all of them be required to pass systemic risk tests before they're allowed on the market. Now, if sovereigns shouldered these 5 responsibilities, we'd have a very different balance of authority between the market and the state. We'd have a responsible market and we'd have a responsible state, each accepting their obligations under law to prevent systemic harm to the populations they seek to benefit. And while this model of responsible sovereignty has some generic properties applicable everywhere, its application in practice will depend on the economic realities of the different countries in question. Strong and weak sovereigns alike will insist that they, as sovereigns, retain what Danny Roderick last night called policy space. Policy space meaning the capacity to protect your own people from global harms. Retaining policy space for sovereign governments is a political imperative. Whatever free market dogma may say, sovereigns will insist on their own banking rules, regulatory frameworks, customs and taxation regimes, capital controls even. Of course, they will carve out this policy space within the constraints of an open international economy. But here's the deal. If they have to choose between defending openness at any price and preserving policy space, they are going to choose the latter. They are going to do that, whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not. They are going to do so. And they're going to do so for deep and important structural reasons. In crisis, politics trumps economics. Political sovereignty must reinforce economic sovereignty because the people from whom sovereignty flows will insist upon it. The sovereign people do not wish to live their life as an experience of passive fate. The promise of sovereignty is to master fate through politics. Sovereigns, though they often fail, incarnate that aspiration for the strong and the weak alike. The aspiration of the people that they will be masters, not slaves, of the economic forces that determine their societies. We began with Roosevelt, and I think it's important to end with him, because that famous remark about having nothing to fear but fear itself had deep political content. It rose from a deep political intuition that Roosevelt had about markets, that economic systems are intrinsically unstable, that markets tend naturally to recurrent disequilibria, that those disequilibria are made worse by fear, and the fear makes the crisis worse. The only agent with the capacity to coerce and the legitimacy to secure consent, the only agent who can stop the fear of falling and put ground under our feet is the sovereign. Thank you for listening.